it's an honor to be invited to the presentation. As the local people know, it's a great day for Rijeka because the Rijeka Football Club has become the leading club in the country yesterday evening. And while the rest of Rijeka is celebrating this, we have something and somebody better to celebrate. David John. And it's a happy event. It's a happy event for us. So in preparing for all this, I went a bit through John's lectures on the YouTube because it's a relatively recent picture of what he's doing. And the first impressive thing is the sheer amount of material. But then comes more impressive stuff, and this is the structure and systematicity. So Professor Searle has started, as you all know, he has started his work in the area of philosophy of language. He did pioneering work on speech acts, correcting Austin, advancing Austin's analysis of speech acts, and then started developing from his own analysis of speech acts that stresses the point of speech acts, the direction of it, the force. He started developing a theory of performative, which is kind of more semantic, and went on developing other aspects of philosophy of language, some of them having application outside the narrow area of philosophy of language, like deriving ought from is, something that we all would like to do when we want to bother other people, and that we would like to be impossible when others want to bother us and tell us that, one, you ought to do this, you ought to do that. But then came the second round, which was turning to intentionality and philosophy of mind. And there was this wonderful negative part, the warming up, which was the Chinese room argument. This was invented way before China became a leading political power. Now it has gained a new force, so to speak. And it's really a very, very nice use of thought experiments in order to question the prevailing fashion at that time in cognitive science, fashion that stayed. So the debate is still actual, but this is the negative, critical part. On the positive side, what Professor Searle did, or John did, whatever we call him, was to start from the parallels between the structure of speech acts and the structure of mental acts. So basically, all you've learned by reading the speech acts book, you can kind of project over the mental, and you have the same duality between the mental attitude on the one hand and its object, the proposition on the other. It's the same duality that you find in the speech act between the attitude of the speaker and the proposition expressed. So suddenly you get this very simple but very elegant and very powerful parallel and analogy between the verbal and the mental. This was around in the air, of course, in analytic philosophy of that time, because language was seen as the key to the mental. But it was formulated in a very elegant, simple in a good sense, and elegant way in Professor Searle's work on intentionality. And it looked like, you know, Husserl's lonely intending creature sitting alone. For Husserl, it's kind of understandable because it was, when he was writing about these things, it was already the rise of dangerous right-wing stuff in Germany, so it was better to be lonely than to have too much company. So the ego is relatively lonely, and I don't know, it or she or he, the ego, it's kind of in the search of other egos, but that's it. With John, you suddenly get something very, very different. And this is that intentionality is, first of all, included into social reality. It becomes a part of social ontology. And it becomes a fundamental feature of social reality, because language offers material for social rules, and social rules, this is not valid for Croatia, but in normal countries, social rules are basis of institutions. We've never had that. We function without rules. But in theory, social rules are really one of the three components that sort of glue social reality. So what happens is that in the course of mere half a century, we get this kind of huge building, which is very structured, very well hanging together, and which is very nice when you read the comments, when people comment John's lectures, and it's an enormous amount of lectures. And the comments is so clear. Oh, for the first time I have understood what this area is about, language, institutions, etc., etc. So you've got this virtue of extreme systematicity, unity, and kind of explanatory power combined on the side of rhetoric with clarity, simplicity. It's understandable for students, which is very, very rare for the work of that height, of that level. And I'm sure that now, in the day after the victory of Rijeka, John will show all these qualities right in the talks he's going to give. Thanks a lot.
Well, I'm very grateful. Does this work? No. Oh, this one works. But can I carry it around? Oh, it's So it works, all right? Sure. Okay, well, I'm immensely grateful for this introduction, and I'm even more grateful for this event. It's the best thing that can happen is to a professional intellectual is to discover somebody's actually listening and somebody's actually paying attention. It's stunning, and as I say, I can't tell you how thankful I am that this conference is taking place, and I only hope to make a presentation that's worthy of the occasion. Now, another thing I'm grateful for is that people are willing to listen to a lecture. It's not in a language that's not the language they learned from their mother and father. That seems to me incredible. I could never do it. I've tried to do it in French, and ça fait bon mien. I mean, it gives me a lot of problems. Now, that was one thing that made a lot of difference to me, and that's about clarity. I think if you can't say it clearly, you don't understand it yourself. I had a French friend who was a famous philosopher, Michel Foucault. And I once said to Michel, "Pourquoi tu écris si mal?" Why do you write so badly? And he said, if I wrote as clearly as you do, no one in France would take me seriously. He said, en France, il faut avoir au moins 10% incompréhensible. You have to have, in France, you have to have at least 10% incomprehensible. Well, I thought that was very bad news, and I think if you have 10% incomprehensible, you're making a very serious mistake. So I'm going to try to get more than 90% comprehensible. Anyway, here goes. Here's the problem. There's a single overriding problem in contemporary philosophy, and that problem, to put it very crudely, is how do we give an account of ourselves that is consistent with what we know about how the world is anyway? See, the remarkable thing is knowledge grows. That's the central intellectual fact of the present era. Knowledge grows. We know much more than our grandparents did. Our grandchildren will know more than we do. Commencement lecturers like to say knowledge grows exponentially, but they don't know what an exponent is, so forget about that. Knowledge grows, and it continues to grow. I mean, we even understand the quantum mechanical nature of the chemical bond. That's a stunning achievement. We just have an enormous amount of knowledge. If Descartes could go into any university bookstore, he'd be staggered by the sheer growth of knowledge over the past 350 years. However, the growth of knowledge has given us an interesting intellectual problem, because the areas where we have solid knowledge in the hard sciences, in chemistry and biology, describe a universe consisting entirely of physical particles in fields of force organized into systems. But these are mindless, meaningless physical particles. And that's all there is to the universe. But we think of ourselves as having consciousness, rationality, speech acts, ethics, aesthetics, politics, political obligations, morality, universities, cocktail parties, and summer vacations. Now, how does all of that fit into a world of mindless, meaningless physical particles? And it's not enough that we should make our conception of ourselves consistent with the physical, with the basic reality, but we have to show how the human reality is a natural consequence. How, given that you have electrons, eventually you're going to have elections. And given that you have protons, eventually you're going to have presidents. Now, how do you get from the one to the other that shows a single, unified reality? And I think that's the most exciting intellectual problem. Now, we have some obstacles in dealing with that problem. And the main obstacle is our idiotic philosophical tradition that says, well, reality divides into two. There's the mental and the physical. There's the Geist and the Fleisch. I mean, it sounds better in different European languages, but this is a stupid mistake, that we live in one reality, and consciousness and intentionality are as much a part of that reality as any other biological phenomena, as photosynthesis and digestion. Okay, now I'm not going to deal with the whole of that question today, but with what I think is an essential part of it. How do we account for the social and institutional reality of money and property and government and marriage and universities? How do we account for that in a universe of mindless, meaningless physical particles? I'm going to try to answer that question. Now, in order to do that, we have to develop some basic distinctions which we can exploit in building up that question. First of all, we need a distinction between two senses. We need two senses of the object-subject distinction. Objectivity and subjectivity loom large in our intellectual culture, but unfortunately, this distinction between objectivity and subjectivity is systematically ambiguous between an epistemic sense, where epistemic means having to do with knowledge, and an ontological sense, where ontological means having to do with existence. And I will just explain that distinction. It's going to be crucial for what follows. In the epistemic sense, you need a distinction between different types of claims. Some claims can be settled as true or false independently of anybody's attitudes. If I say that let's say Dostoevsky was a Russian author, that claim is epistemically objective. You can settle that as a matter of fact. If I say that Dostoevsky was a better author than Chekhov, well, that's a matter of subjective opinion. A lot of Russians whose opinions I respect would disagree with that. So that's the distinction between the epistemic sense of objectivity and subjectivity. There are different types of claims. But underlying that distinction is a distinction in modes of existence. Some things have an existence which is totally independent of being felt or experienced. Pains and tickles and itches are not like that. Mountains and molecules and tectonic plates are. Mountains, molecules, and tectonic plates have an existence which is ontologically objective, whereas pains and tickles and itches have an existence which is ontologically subjective. Now, the importance of the distinction, there are many importances of making this distinction, but one importance is this. There are whole domains that are ontologically subjective, like human consciousness, where it's possible to make claims that are epistemically objective. You can have an epistemically objective science of a domain that is ontologically subjective. And this is important because in the old days, I used to go over to the medical school in San Francisco and tell these guys, get me a solution of the problem of consciousness. How does the brain do it? And the standard argument I got was, consciousness is not part of science, because science is objective, but consciousness is subjective. Therefore, there cannot be a science of consciousness. Now, you all recognize that's a fallacy of ambiguity over the epistemic and the ontological sense. Consciousness is indeed ontologically subjective, but the ontological subjectivity of the domain does not prevent us from having an epistemically objective account of that domain. And we're very soon going to discover this is true of human social reality. It has an element of ontological subjectivity because it's all a human creation. Money, property, government, marriage, all the rest of it, football games are human creations and thus ontologically subjective. But nonetheless, it can be an epistemically objective fact about an ontologically subjective domain that Rijeka won. Just as it was at one time a year ago, an epistemically objective fact that Barca, there's no reason why you should care about this, it's a different part of Europe. But anyway, that Barca beat Juventus. This was very important in Barcelona. I don't suppose anybody cared about it in Rijeka, but this is the kind of ontological subjectivity that leads to epistemic objectivity. Okay, now, is everybody with us? You see, like all American tourists, I'm deeply convinced that only if you speak English loudly, everybody will understand. Okay? So I'm assuming that everybody understands. How does this go for speed? Are you understanding me? Everybody looks so intelligent, I think they must be understanding. But anyway, we'll see how it goes. Okay, now, another distinction, absolutely crucial, is between those features of the world that are observer independent and those that are observer relative. Now, observer independent features are those whose existence doesn't give a damn about us. The sun and the solar system really don't care about us. But many things that are interesting to us, like the social phenomena of money and private property, government and political power, those only exist because people think they exist. It's not a fact of nature that Trump is president. It's an observer-relative phenomenon. Now, this is going to be important, it turns out, because all observer-relative phenomena, money, property, government, marriage, cocktail parties, and summer vacations, are created by ontologically subjective human mental states. To put it crudely, civilization is created by consciousness, as consciousness is ontologically subjective. But nonetheless, it's an epistemically objective fact that Trump is president. It's not just my opinion. It is an established epistemically objective fact about a domain that is ontologically subjective. Okay, now with that under our belts, let us now state the problem that faces us. And philosophers like paradoxes. Here's the paradox. The paradox is that there are a whole lot of objective facts in the world about things that are matters of opinion. I travel around Europe a lot, so I have a whole lot of strange-looking documents. Well, I don't have a lot, but I got enough to get a cup of coffee anyway. I have these strange-looking documents, and they are amazing because it's money. You see, to Americans, it looks like monopoly money. It doesn't really look like money. And so we're constantly amazed. You give this to them, and they'll give you a cup of coffee or whatever it is you want. Okay. So you have this domain that is epistemically objective, but it's all a matter of opinion. They don't say what I would say. Well, maybe you think it's money, but why should we care what you think? You see, it doesn't have enough on it. It just says 10 euros, not much else. Anyway, that's a naive way to put the question that I will be addressing. What fact about this phenomenon makes it money, given that it's an epistemically objective fact, but the domain is ontologically subjective? Okay, here goes. We're going to talk about a certain kind of animal behavior. The animal behavior by which we create social ontology. We create a reality of cocktail parties and universities and summer vacations and football games. And I'm going to talk about the ontological structure. And here's an amazing fact. My dogs are very intelligent. And I get a lot of information from my conversations with my dogs, from their canine intelligence. And in order, they have been very intelligent. In order, their names are Frege, Russell, Ludwig, Gilbert, and now Tarski. Tarski is so called because he was flown in from Warsaw. My vet assured me there are no decent Berner Sennenhund, no decent Bernese Mountain Dog puppies available in the United States. The whole United States. We had to fly him in from Warsaw, so Tarski came in from Warsaw. Well, why Tarski? Well, you have to have a name that's Polish, but you have to be able to shout it around the neighborhood. No child is going to run around the neighborhood shouting, Lukasiewicz or Kotarbinski. No, it's ridiculous. I mean, not even Kolakowski. It's too much for a dog. So Tarski. Anyway, I'm sorry Tarski isn't here, but he's my good advisor. Now here's the interesting point. Intelligent though he is not there thinking about his income tax or what should we do next week. He can think there's somebody at the door, but he can't think there are 7 people at the door, and I wish 3 of them would come back next week because I'm busy thinking about what I'm going to do when it comes time to buy Christmas presents. He does not think any of those thoughts. Why not? Well, that's what we're going to do. The question we're going to face is, what do you need, given basic human biology shared with animals, what do you need to create an institutional reality of money and universities and cocktail parties and all the rest? And I'm going to say you need a certain rather limited number of phenomena. I'm going to go through them. 1, humans have the capacity to cooperate. Many animals also have that, but we'll have a name for that. Collective intentionality. Just humans, like all sorts of other animals, have collective intentionality. They can intentionality. They have a capacity to cooperate with other humans and also with other animals. When my dogs and I go for a walk, we are walking together. That's a collective intentionality. All right, now humans also have a capacity which is rare but still common to many animals, and that is they can impose functions on people and objects, and the imposition of function is always observer relative. And in fact, our life is surrounded with imposed functions. Here's one, here's another, here's a third, here's another. All of these functions are imposed by human beings, and because functions are imposed, it's always the imposition of function. They have an element of ontological subjectivity because there has to be some attitude by which the function is imposed. But the imposition of the function can nonetheless be an epistemically objective fact. It's an epistemically objective fact that this is a watch and this is a cup. Those are epistemically objective facts, even though the imposition of the function is observer relative and thus contains an element of ontological subjectivity. Okay, everybody's up with us so far. Now comes a stunning development, and it takes my breath away every time I think about it, and that's this. Humans have a capacity. See, part of the fun of the philosophy, by the way, is you get to be amazed by what any sane person takes for granted. See, any sane person thinks, well, okay, so he's got a 10-euro note. Why is that a big deal? Why does he keep showing it off? Well, the answer is because in philosophy you want to be amazed by what any sane person takes for granted. And I want to say, this is amazing. Now I'm going to tell you an amazing fact. Humans, and as far as I know, no other animals have the capacity to impose functions on objects where the object does not perform the function in virtue of its physical structure, but in virtue of the fact that the object or person has been assigned a certain status by collective intentionality, and with that status goes a function that can only be performed in virtue of the collective acceptance of that status. Now, that last sentence I uttered was so long it sounds like German philosophy translated into English, so let me state it again so you get it. Here's the basic idea. There are a class of functions, and I'm going to introduce a name for these. I'm going to call these stated functions. There are a class of functions that can only be performed by a person or an object because the person or the object has been assigned a certain status, and with that status, a function that can only be performed if there is a collective acceptance of that status. The physics of the person or the object is not enough. There has to be a collective acceptance of the person or object as having a status, and these are status functions. Now, many of the examples of functions I gave you are not status functions. These two objects perform their functions solely in virtue of their physical structure. If you try to use this one to keep time, it doesn't work. If you try to use this one to drink out of, it doesn't work. They perform their function in virtue of the physical structure. But this one has a physical structure which is utterly trivial. It's just a bunch of ink marks on paper, and yet it performs a function that's very important to us because we accept that this is money. We accept that it has a certain status, and with that status, a certain function, the function of money. And I'm going to make a strong claim. The key to understanding human civilization is status functions. We live in a sea of status functions. Every one of us in this room is a citizen of some country, or we're a member of a university, or we're the owner of a driver's license in Rijeka or in California, or we own property. In my case, among the property I actually own a dog named Tarski. So there are all of these status functions functions that can be performed only in virtue of the collective acceptance of a status where the physics of the object is not enough. Now let me pause on that. Often the physics of the object is essential to the status function. For example, I am able to drive a car no matter what anybody thinks. That's a physical fact. But in the state of California, you have to become a licensed driver. The state of California gives me a license, and it's only because I have the status function of being a licensed driver that I'm actually entitled to drive a car. Oh, where's my driver's license? Okay, don't let anybody leave the room because you can't do anything. Here it is, yes. A California driver's license, and believe it or not, in many places you need this just to get a beer. You know, yes, but are you really 21 years old? Anyway, you have the status function of being a licensed driver, even though the fact that I can drive a car is a physical fact. Now notice another thing that is implicit in what I've said. Not only do you have status functions, but you have status indicators where the status is indicated by some markers. The existence of a driver's license is a status indicator, as is the uniform worn by the policeman, or the wedding ring worn by the woman who is recently married. All of those are status indicators. They primarily perform an epistemic function. You can tell who's married, who's a driver. My passport tells you that I'm a citizen of the United States. Those are all status indicators, and often a status indicator acquires a kind of life of its own as a status function. Okay, but now our question is, how are status functions created? And I think it can't be very complicated. It must be a simple mechanism because we're not all that smart. And it's got to be something any human beings can do, and pretty much any human beings can create status functions. So how do they do it? Now I'm going to go into a theoretical account of the creation of status functions. And I want to say, and this goes back to my earliest work, we need a distinction between those features of reality that require an institution for their existence. So the fact that this is money is an institutional fact. The fact that it contains carbon-based molecules, that's not an institutional fact. That's just a brute fact. And it seemed to me in my early days that there was a distinction between brute facts, like the fact that the Earth is 93 billion miles from the sun, and institutional facts, like the fact that I am a licensed driver. Institutional facts require institutions, brute facts do not. That seems to me pretty good, though a lot of my students are misled. Typically, you need the institution of language in order to state a brute fact. To say that the Earth is 93 million miles from the sun, you have to have an institution. But the fact stated, the actual relationship of the Earth and the sun, that is not an institutional fact. So our question was how are institutional facts possible? And there it seemed to me we need a difference between different kinds of rules. We need rules that regulate pre-existing forms of behavior, but you also need rules that constitute the very behavior that they regulate. So constitutive rules are, for example, the rules of football or the rules of money. They don't just regulate playing football, they constitute playing football. But the rule in Croatia that says drive on the right-hand side of the road, that's a regulative rule, not a constitutive rule. So now it looks as if our crucial question, what is the structure of the constitutive rules that enables us to apply them to create status functions, where status functions are facts within human institutions and thus are institutional facts. So it looks like constitutive rules generate institutional facts, and the ones that interest are status functions. All right, now it looks pretty good. I mean, I think it's, of a simple structure, and I'm going to show you both its power and its weakness. It's going to turn out it's not quite right, but here's the next step. The structure of the constitutive rules is always the same. We say that a certain object X or a certain person counts as having a status function. So to show off my money again, this counts as money in the European Union, and its X counts as Y, and this is the structure of the constitutive rules. X counts as Y, typically in context C. The philosopher's favorite example is chess. Such and such a move counts as a legal knight move. Such and such a position counts as check. Such and such a form of check counts as checkmate. Okay, so it looks pretty good. We've got a structure of institutional reality made through the application of constitutive rules, which are always of the form X counts as Y. It doesn't quite work. I'm going to tell you what's wrong with it in a minute, but it's pretty good. And you might say, well, but isn't that too pathetic? X counts as Y and C. You're going to create all of human civilization with X counts as Y and C. You're going to create Donald Trump and victory in the World Cup. All of those are just X counts. It looks too ridiculous. Well, it has two formal features that give it a remarkable amount of power. The constitutive rule iterates upward indefinitely, and it spreads laterally. Now let me explain all of that. I make noises through my mouth. These noises count as the utterance of English sentences, but certain utterances of English sentences count as making a promise. You see what's happening? You have X1 counts as Y1, but Y1 equals X2, and that counts as Y2. So noises to promises, certain promises count as legally binding contracts, and some contracts, for example, count as getting married. And then, of course, all hell breaks loose from an institutional point of view in the state of California. Once you get married, you get income tax deductions, special spousal rights in your pensions. And I know males who even got pregnancy leave. The conception that people have of biology must be very crude if you can have a difficult pregnancy even though you're a male. But in any case, in California, anything is possible. Okay, so you have this absurd, you have this thing where this is more powerful than it seems because it iterates upward indefinitely. And then, of course, it spreads out. I don't just have money, but I have money in my bank account at the Bank of America on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, California, and it's put there by my employers, the Regents of the University of California, and I use it to pay my state and federal income tax and my credit card bills and all that kind of stuff. We are locked into a sea of status functions which have this structure X counts as Y in C. Okay. All of that's pretty good, but it's not quite right. And I'm going to show you, often in philosophy, it's not enough to get almost there. You have to try to get all the way there, and then when you get all the way there, you see how the resulting theory is much better. I paid a lot for this damn now, so I'm not going to let it be boring. All right, this table. Yes, okay. All right, so here we are. We got a theory so far. Now I'm going to show you what's wrong with it, why it doesn't quite work. Everybody with us so far. Okay, now here goes. One of the problems is sometimes you don't need an X term in order to create the Y status function. Y is a status function. My favorite example is money, but of course most money has no physical existence at all. You have a status function without an object on which the function is composed. See, most of your money, I don't have enough so it makes a difference, but most of my money is in the form of computer, magnetic traces on computer disks and banks. But those magnetic traces on money, you can't bend the magnet. What you got on the magnet is a representation of the amount of money. So what's going on in these cases where you have what some philosophers call a freestanding Y term? You don't have an X term on which it's based. And furthermore, sometimes you have institutional facts without an institution. In the case, should I walk around with that? No, I'm okay. Okay, that's for you and this one's for me. Okay. You have an institutional fact without an institution. So the kids get together and they decide that someone is going to be the captain of the team, even though there was no previously existing institution for selecting the captain. So what's going on in these cases? And then there's a question I should have asked myself, and that is, what kind of a speech act is it anyway to count something as something it isn't intrinsically? See, back to Donald Trump, it's true that he's president, but it's not part of his DNA. I mean, it's not an intrinsic fact about him. It's all observer, relative. It's all somehow a creation of a convention. It's, in a sense, arbitrary. What's going on in these cases? Okay, now we're going to introduce, and how much time do I have? Am I doing all right? How many? Okay. All right. In the end, I'll collapse from exhaustion before I run out of ideas. So anyway, here goes. You have a remarkable fact that we can impose these status functions linguistically. We make him president just by saying certain words. Or I am a citizen of the United States just because of certain marks on my passport and on my birth certificate. What's happening in those cases? And we need to ask ourselves, well, how many kinds of things can we do with language? Anyway, and now I'm going to introduce something that we have not previously discussed, and that is the role of language. And I'm going to say that key to understanding institutional reality is the special role of language. But in order to understand that role, we have to understand the different ways that language has of relating to reality. In the case of statements, assertions, and all the rest of it, which I call assertives, language has what I call the word-to-world direction of fit. Think of words up here and the world down here. And these can be true or false. So if I say, we're now on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea, that is a word-to-world direction of fit. The words are supposed to fit the facts. These are assertives. Now, two other kinds of speech acts are directives, where you make commands, orders, requests, pleading, begging, praying. These are directives, but they don't have that direction of fit. They have the world-to-word direction of fit, and the assertive statements, assertions, characterizations, descriptions, these can be true or false. These cannot be true or false. These are obeyed or kept or disobeyed, etc. Finally, there's another a favorite class that philosophers have of the commissives, and the philosopher's favorite example is the promise. And in the promise, you also have the word-to-word direction of fit. The promise is not true or false, but it is kept or broken, fulfilled or frustrated. All of those are cases where the promise is such that the world has to change to match the words. If I promise to go to Croatia, then I have to change my behavior to match the content of the promise. Okay, but now, are there any others? Well, there are lots of other funny ones, like apologies, thanks, and congratulations, where you sort of take the fit for granted. But the cases that interest me are the cases where you make something the case by saying it is the case, and thus you change the world to match the words, and thus achieve word-to-word direction of fit. But you make something the case by saying it is the case That is to say, you make it the case by representing it as being the case. You achieve the world-to-word direction of fit in virtue of the word-to-world direction of fit. And I call those declarations, where you make something the case by declaring it to be the case, and you get both direction of fit in the same speech act. Now, how is that possible? How can there be a form of language where you change reality just by saying that it's changed? Well, let me give you some obvious examples. Austin's performatives were the obvious examples of declarations. If the chairman is duly qualified, when the chairman says the meeting is adjourned, that makes it the case that the meeting is adjourned, and thus achieves this upward direction of fit, but it does it by representing the meeting as being adjourned. By saying the meeting is adjourned, you make it the case that the meeting is adjourned. Now I want to say there are lots of cases like that that are inexplicit, where you don't have a performative verb. I was busy showing off European money. Let me show off some American money. And again, as everything else in life, it's philosophically quite stunning. It says, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Everybody in this room is an epistemologist. We wonder, how do they know? How do they know that it's legal tender for all debts? Have they done a study? Is there a survey? And the answer, of course, there's no survey and no study. They make it the case that it's legal tender by declaring it to be the case. And this is often the case that you create a reality by representing it. You receive a letter saying that you are now a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and that is a declaration that makes it the case. Or you are sworn in as a new citizen of the United States. All of these are cases where you create an institutional reality by declaring it to exist. And I now am going to make a strong claim, the strongest claim in this lecture, and that is all of these status functions are created by declaration, and they're all what I call status function declarations. The status function declaration creates status functions. And indeed, though this is less obvious, but I think it's also true, they're maintained in their continuous existence by speech acts that have the form of the declaration. It needn't be explicit. Think of a love affair. It's not a good idea to say, I hereby declare that we are now lovers. That's too explicit. You don't want to do it that way. You let it grow gradually. Let the representations become part of the reality, and the reality will change so as to match the content of the representation. So there are lots of official status functions. Money and private property and universities and governments, but there are lots of unofficial status functions. Friendships and love affairs, for example, have the characteristics of a status function. Now you might say, well, why do we do all this? What are we doing? And now comes the next part of this lecture, and that's this. Institutional facts create status functions. And if you ask why do we do this, status functions without exception have power. The reason we create status functions is it gives us power, but what kind of power does it give us? It gives us what I call deontic powers, rights, duties, obligations, requirements, responsibilities, authorizations, and permissions. So status functions generate deontic powers. And why are these deontic powers so important? Because the deontic powers give us reasons for action that are independent of our inclinations. We have desire-independent reasons for action. And those are the key to understanding human civilization. Status functions create deontic powers, Deontic powers give desire independent reasons for action, rights, duties, obligations, requirements, responsibilities, and all of those are created by language. They're all created by status function declarations. So to my original claim, which you remember was, well, all status functions are created by X counts as Y and Z. No, that's misleading. That's the standard form. But all status functions are created by representations that have the logical form of status function declarations because they make it the case that a status function exists by representing it as existing. This may be completely informal, as when you exchange love affairs with your beloved, or it may be completely formal, as when you get a letter saying that you have been inducted into the United States Army, or that your citizenship has now been terminated, or that you've been hired as a professor in the University of California, Berkeley. All of these status functions create deontic powers, and they all give you desire independent reasons for action. Now, I don't think this is very complicated. I mean, I'm sorry I had to go through so many steps, but let me just summarize it, because basically, the basic idea is very simple. What distinguishes humans from other animals is not collective intentionality. They have that, we have it. It's not even the imposition of function, because some animals can do that. They have beaver dams, and the monkey can use a stick to dig out ants with. What distinguishes humans from other social animals are status functions. And the reason that that distinguishes humans from other animals is that status functions enable us to create power relations where the power is not just a matter of brute physical force, but it's a matter of what? The acceptance of a deontology. Now, if that sounds too theoretical, let me give you a real-life example. Some nice person invited me to give a lecture in Rijeka, and I accepted. Now notice, on the day in question, I can't say, well, it's kind of a nice hotel room. I'd rather spend the morning asleep in the hotel room. No, I made a promise. That's why I'm here. I made a promise, and it's no good saying, well, we had a lot to drink last night, so I think I'll just sleep in this morning. No, I'm here because we created a deontic power. And if you think about it, you'll find that your life is entirely wrapped up in elaborate systems of status functions. We do this to create power, and I've now given you a rather simple set of equations, and let me go through it. Status functions without exception are deontic powers. How are they created? They're all created by status function declarations, and I might say they're maintained in their existence by continuous status function declarations. And again, I have to take that carefully. By representations that have the logical form of status function declarations, even in cases where they are not performed explicitly, even where it's only done informally or implicitly. By the way, this is the source of a lot of problems among different cultures. The English and Americans have the illusion that they understand each other because in some points the languages overlap. But the conception of human relationships, well, that is quite a different thing. I lived in Oxford for some years before I finally figured that out. And the difference in the status function, I won't go into detail, but what constitutes a love affair, well, that's not a good example. What constitutes a friendship in England is quite different from what constitutes a friendship in the United States, and all of these are differently marked by the forms of the deontology in question. In any case, status functions are institutional facts. They're all created in existence by declarations. They're maintained in their existence by continued status function declarations. They all create powers, and the powers are the glue that hold human civilization together because they give us reasons for action that are independent of our inclinations. Now you might say, well, if that's all there is to it, how do we do it? I mean, how do you tell the good ones from the bad ones? Well, that's the next step. The next step is to say, what can you do with this apparatus that you can't do otherwise? Now, I want to say it's remarkably powerful.
somebody got the ideas in the European Enlightenment. I'm not sure who was the first person. In addition to the rights of your institution, your droit de seigneur, or your rights as a citizen, or your right as a king, there are human rights. Just being human is the Y term in X counts as Y. And with that came one of the single most exciting ideas of the 18th century, that human beings have rights just in virtue of human beings. That's one application among many of the apparatus that I have been giving you. So I want to say the next step, and I haven't done it, but I think you now have the means for deciding, is to figure out what exactly is the rational organization of society that enables us to create a sets of institutions together with their corresponding institutional facts that give us power relations that are just and fair and equitable, but at the same time flexible enough so that we can deal with the continuing changes in a society. And I have to say, one of the things that's most impressive about Europe over the past 50 or 60 years that I've been coming to Europe is that they have finally gotten out of this stupid idea that the thing to do is to kill your neighbor all the time. The French and the Germans even have stopped killing each other, and they have found a wonderful substitute for warfare. It's called football. Now, why is it so important? Well, you have to observe these people with enough detachment. When the French won the World Cup, the demonstrations in Paris were the greatest since the end of the Second World War. The only comparable victory to a victory in the Second World War was victory in the World Cup. Now that's a wonderful advance in civilization. Remember, de Gaulle was a colossal liar. He said, "La France a été libérée par les Français." Total nonsense. France was liberated by Englishmen and Americans, but it was very important to their self-conception that they were libérés par les Français. But even more important, ils ont gagné la Coupe du Monde. I'm sorry to speak French in such an august gathering as this, but I want to tell you this was a wonderful advance in civilization. You can have national pride without killing anybody. Just you need to score more goals, okay? And I give that as one example. Now, I want to suggest, though, that I'm now going to stop talking, but I don't want to suggest that this is a finished product. On the contrary, I see this as an ongoing research project, and I hope you will all help in that research project. Thank you very much.